been asked quite a lot by some of our clients and partners to have a recap of our red teaming versus penetration testing webinar. So what we'll do today is cover some of the key differences between each of these different services, especially from Group IB's position and hopefully from yours, and learn a few key items about both of these initiatives. So the agenda for today's webinar is to define red teaming, certainly as our offensive security team defines it, and discuss that with how you do as well. We'll also look at the differences between red teaming and penetration testing in terms of the project objectives, the project focus, the deliverables for each of these different projects, and of course the attack methods that may be used. And one of the main differences is of course the project action plan as well. We'll also cover some real cases from Group IB red teaming operations and look at some of the different project objectives, from Group IB's perspective when discussing red teaming operations. And if you have any questions, there's a question panel in the GoToMeeting panel item here. If you type your question, we'll try to work it into the presentation or have a session at the end of today's webinar. So red teaming as a definition, it's an advanced type of security assessment, and really it comes from military terms to see if an organization or a group is ready to defend itself against an attacker. I would say in the purest sense, it's a very specialized simulation of a real attack from actors that you might see targeting your bank or e-commerce company on a daily or once in a lifetime basis. But it's a test of your true position in your security posture from an advanced actor. The red teaming approach is derived from, of course, military operations to ensure readiness of an organization to defend against an attack. In terms of the project objectives, this is where some of the key differences come in between pen test and red teaming operations. Now, both of these different services checks the ability of an organization's security systems to defend against an attack, but only red teaming sees if the entire company and its networks are prepared to withstand an advanced persistent threat, for example, from financially motivated cybercriminals like Cobalt or Money Taker, or even nation-state actors like Lazarus. The third point here about what it does and what it doesn't do is that red teaming doesn't basically, the company and the security units know about the test and they do not defend against it. For pen tests, that's true, and for red teaming, their objective is to defend against it as if they were going through day-to-day operations and experiencing a real incident. In terms of training the company's security team and employees to defend against APTs, the goal is not true for pen tests. However, it is true for red teaming. During a red teaming operation, Pavel and his team or other companies that you might get to employ a red team should be using different tools and techniques that different APT actors might have within their repertoire, and test those tools and techniques on your organization's both security technology stack, but also your security department in terms of readiness. In terms of the main objective, for red teaming, the main objective is not to identify as many vulnerabilities as possible. Its main objective is to basically achieve a goal. Whether that goal be to reach sensitive systems within inside a bank, such as SWIFT or card processing systems, whereas the goal for pen test is really to identify all of the weak spots that exist within the security stack to date and try and plug the holes in the boat, so to speak, so that the water might stop leaking out, and then you might be ready for red teaming in the future. For red teaming, the goal is to potentially access to different critical infrastructure, as we said, escalate privileges to take over IT administration accounts, or exfiltrate sensitive documentations. So that's the last point here. Red teaming really has a specific goal, and you should have that specific goal in mind when you start to acquire red teaming services from an offensive security team like Group IB. In terms of the project focus and some of the different deliverables and attack methods, let's talk about some of the differences between red teaming and penetration tests when it comes to these different parameters. So in terms of project focus, for penetration tests, it's important to cover as many attack vectors as possible during the pen test. The goal is really to identify as many vulnerabilities that might exist, where patch management processes have failed within the bank or e-commerce company, and to patch those up and make sure that there's no kind of weak spots within the security stack in existence. In project focus for red teaming, it's really all about depth. The goal is to go as deep as possible and not report anything outside of the initial objectives. If the objective is to gain access to the ATM systems within the bank, that's exactly what the access ATMs. In terms of the vectors and methods of attack, for penetration tests, it's basically technical attack methods against the service in the target scope. It excludes destructive methods. Social engineering is utilized during a penetration test, but only if it's authorized by the customer. So it could be used in penetration tests. In red teaming, all methods can be employed to achieve the objective. This can even include using offensive or destructive methods if it's approved by the client, of course. In terms of deliverables, there's some commonalities between both of these services. One is the general conclusions for top management. We will include those within a penetration test, but also within a red teaming operations to provide the conclusions of both of those tests that were conducted. Also, detailed information about each project stage, what vulnerabilities were identified, what different holes were identified within the security stack. Both of those will be provided in a final report for penetration testing and red teaming. In terms of additional commonalities, of course, recommendations will be provided for both of these types of services. However, with red teaming, it will be more in line with the project's goals. In terms of deliverables, what is different between these two different services? Detailed information about all discovered vulnerabilities and the different risk scores that are associated with these vulnerabilities are provided with penetration tests, but specifically with the red teaming operations, the deliverable is to detail all of the informations, the techniques and tools that were used to achieve the red teaming goal. Or if the goal was failed, to provide information about how the security staff or security stack actually prevented against the red team from achieving their particular goals. So those are some of the key differences when looking at the project's focus, deliverables, and different attack methods as well. In terms of the action plan, there's some key differences as well when it comes to scoping out the project action plan. With penetration testing, the project plan is very linear. It goes from identifying the scope to reconnaissance, to exploitation of different vulnerabilities, to gaining access to different systems, and then to provide a full report. The project duration is typically fixed and it's predictable. So this is really the key outline of penetration test when it comes to the project action plan. It's very linear. When it comes to looking at red teaming, the project plan can be very flexible. They can shift between gaining persistence to going back to exploiting different vulnerabilities, regaining access to a system, gaining access to other systems, maybe going back to the reconnaissance phase, identifying other systems that might exist. So the plan can be very flexible, and it depends on the approved TTPs from the bank, whether that be including different offensive means to conduct the red teaming operations or not, or many other variables that might be included. And of course, based on the scenario, the red team may get stuck at a certain phase. They may have to go back a step and try and gain access part of the system in order to reach their final goals. So it can be very flexible in terms of the plan. Just as if a real attacker was attacking your network, he may try many different methods to gain access to his objective or her objective as well. So those are some of the key differences between red teaming and penetration testing. And now we'll look at some actual real red teaming cases from Group IB offensive security team, Pavel's team specifically. In the first case that we'll look at today, it was a large industrial company, and we were given the objective by the client to gain administrative access to the headquarters Active Directory domain controller. The situation was that the customer used multi-factor authentication, specifically smart cards, for all types of access to the HQ, and this included remote and external web services as well. In this specific red team, there was no social engineering that was permitted in this specific case. In terms of the solution, so how did we actually gain access to the HQ's domain directory? We conducted, of course, deep reconnaissance at the initial phase. We identified that the HQ during this specific red teaming operation had actually acquired 14 different companies, and they were currently reorganizing them as part of branches during the red team operations. Of course, this was a little bit lucky for our red team, but of course, it's a realistic and real life test of the security stack and also security teams within the specific client organization. With the Group IB red team, they managed to get permission from the client to actually conduct attack against some of these different branches. Of course, it was part of their organization. And Group IB's red team managed to gain access to the Active Directory of one of the branches, and it was one of the initial compromise of a weaker branch. And they were able to identify a site-to-site full mesh VPN. Here in solution of part 2, we established that network connectivity was okay and very well firewalled from the first branch. So gaining access to the HQ from the first branch was impossible, but it was possible to extend the attack to the second branch of their domain, and the red team got access to the domain admin rights there. From the branch 2, the Active Directory domain trust between branch 2 and the HQ were abused by the Kerberos golden ticket technique by Group IB's red team, and they managed to get access to the HQ's domain controllers, and our red teaming goal was achieved in this particular instance. So that was the first case that we looked at for red teaming operation. And this is the second case that Group IB's red team was involved in. This particular organization was a large retail company, and the objective was to actually gain access to the internal financial systems within the company's HQ as well. The situation or lay of the land in this particular situation was that the HQ's external network perimeter had few published servers, and they were very well protected. The majority of the systems were also cloud-based and public. Also in this particular red team, no social engineering was allowed by the client, but attacks against the customer's branches were not permitted, as the customer also felt that this was an ineffective attack route. The main reason for this was that the branches weren't actually connected to any of the HQ's based information systems. So what did we do in this particular situation? Group IB's red team managed to identify a third-party company server that was listed in some of the public mail DNS FPF records and permitted to send emails on behalf of the company. So this was an interesting finding during the reconnaissance phase, and the server was not actually part of any public cloud-based services. The need for the server was really unknown for us, but the server also had some web pages that were under development and related to the customer. They also had the same open VPN TCP port and non-standard number as one of the customer servers had. Here you can see some of that information. So this was a very interesting finding for Group IB's red team. Our next step was actually to identify the server's owner. The Group IB red team contacted them and managed to get his official permission to actually conduct offensive efforts against the server. And the way that they did this was actually offering free penetration testing services to this particular server. So with this, Group IB's red team was able to compromise the server that it found, and it had some systems under development that the customer's subcontractor had created. In addition to this, to get data from these systems, the customer created a restricted VPN tunnel from the compromised server to the customer's local access network. The red team then copied the OpenVPN configuration and accessed the data. The VPN in this particular situation was very poorly restricted. The list of internal IP that were allowed to communicate were limited by push route in this particular scenario. The VPN also had unrestricted access to the local network as well, and the routes were configured on the clients manually. After the red team gained access to the local area network, the red team used typical lateral movement techniques to then obtain access to the domain administration rights and access different internal financial systems within this particular retail client and achieve their objective. So that was a pretty interesting case for us to use many different elements during the reconnaissance phase and identify interesting elements to gain access to the bank's network. In terms of the tools that are used in red team versus penetration testing, during the reconnaissance phase, Group IB often uses our threat intelligence service that is proprietary, of course, to Group IB. We identify many different pieces of information that may be, compromised by cybercriminals, or new tools or techniques that are employed by APT threat actors. And Pavel, lucky enough for him, has access to all of these tools and techniques as well, so they can apply these different methods against our customers. We also have a self-developed framework that excelled the advantages of many different standalone technical reconnaissance tools, and the frameworks can be used for continuous monitoring of external network perimeter, during the reconnaissance phase. For persistence, they prefer to use a target's remote access system, usually with some improvements like modifications to different access control groups. And in some case, Group IB uses advanced covert channels like DNS transports that can work from almost anywhere. During exploitation, the same tools as penetration test with some improvements, typically with custom shell codes from Group IB's red teaming, and of course utilizing some of the different exploits that may be used by advanced cybercriminals detected by Group IB threat intelligence. And we prefer to use different exploit architecture vulnerabilities first because they're not always obvious for automatic detection tools within the security stack for the client organization. The exploit often looks like a normal system admin process, and for that, it's typically a way for the red team to gain access without being detected during the exploitation phase. From Group IB, our service, of course, with Pavel, is to provide basically an assessment of your system's readiness against an advanced attacker. Pavel and his team get all of the goodies that Group IB Threat Intelligence has identified from advanced actors. What tools and techniques have been used to infiltrate the systems of some of the most advanced and well-protected networks of financial institutions around the world. And our goal is to provide that information to you to test your security team and security stack's readiness against an advanced attacker. In providing the benefits to your organization, Group IB's offensive security team will provide a summary for all of your senior level management, how well you defended against, or maybe how the goal was actually achieved, so you can then invest money into different defensive security systems that you might be looking for. So this might be an interesting strategy for a CISO to gain access to potentially additional funds that you require to better protect your network. Of course, you'll get detailed technical findings with expert recommendations from Pavel's team about how to enhance your security posture. Whether you're looking at investing into new defensive tools, sandbox, endpoints, Pavel and his team will be sure to provide the technical details about our findings and his recommendations for enhancing security posture. And of course, as we're doing the red team, if we identify any very critical vulnerabilities, we'll provide you with immediate notification so that you can defend against them. In terms of the red teaming scope and timeline overview, typically when we begin a red teaming operation, we sit down with the customer and we understand, of course, what the objective is. That's the key for the red teaming operation, really understanding what the objective is. Is it gaining access to the SWIFT systems, to card processing systems? Maybe it's getting access simply to the local access network and exfiltrating sensitive documents. Also, we'll set the project time limits and define a scope that can be involved from the red teaming operations. Are we allowed or not allowed to employ offensive or destructive methods against the network? Are we allowed or not allowed to attack different networks that might be considered out of scope for your particular organization? And of course, we'll define the frequency and the structure of the project as well. During the engagement phase, of course, we'll define communication channels. Do you prefer to use secure mail? Do we want to have an ongoing, secure mail chat to keep you updated about the different aspects and achievements of the project? And during the engagement phase, we'll also receive the permissions necessary for Pavel and his team to conduct efforts against every aspect of your organization. Then we'll conduct the attack. And you try to defend against us. And then, of course, we'll provide our report with different recommendations that might have happened to enhance security posture, and of course, to provide information about how the goal was either achieved or how you defended against our advanced attack. So that is today's webinar about red teaming versus penetration testing. And at this point, we'll pause here for any questions that you may want to ask. And of course, our wonderful marketing team will send out the PowerPoint deck to you afterwards, so you can share it with your clients if you're a Group IB partner, or if you wanted to have some of this information at your ready when you're evaluating red teaming versus penetration testing in the future. So there's a few interesting questions from the attendees to the webinar today. One of them is, what type of destructive methods can be used during a red teaming operations? Typically, during a penetration test, the goal isn't to, of course, destruct the network. The goal is to identify any potential weak spots that may exist within the security stack and provide the recommendations on patch management or shoring up some of the different holes that are discovered. During the red teaming operations, of course, if it's permitted, Group IB's red team may employ different, so to speak, risky exploits that could cause destruction or disruption to the network. Of course, Pavel can talk a little bit more about what some of these exploits are, but typically within penetration tests, these more risky exploits that could potentially cause disruption to services would not be employed.
Thank you, Nick. In some cases, during penetration test, we faced with situations when exploits can really crash systems. For penetration test projects, it's not important. We can just report such kind of situations and explore different other systems. But during the red teaming, in some cases, the systems can provide a key for our objectives.
Mm-hmm.
So we have to develop exploit to make it more stable and to run it against our target. Of course, our customers should understand that it's risky, so we have to warn them about it.
There's another question from an attendee. Does group? Oh, there's a very large question that came over it, and I can't see it. So the question was, does Group IB do both penetration testing and red teaming? Of course, we do, and we'll sit down with the client at the beginning to understand what their particular objective might be. Next question, just let me read this first. Yeah, that's an interesting question, actually, regarding red teaming timing, asking about specific customer trends. Do we see a large trend of people going through regular pen testing cycles and then perhaps engaging on a red teaming operation? Typically, we do see a lot of organizations conducting penetration tests throughout a regular cycle to ensure that there's no weak spots identified within the security stack, and then employing specifically to test the individuals within the security staff and their readiness against different offensive efforts. Moreover, sometimes within a similar industry, there might be an event where an organization has an incident and it was successful, and our clients typically would want to test and see if they're able to defend against a similar type of exercise with their existing security setup. So that's typically what we see for the cycles. There's also another question regarding timing. How long does it take the red teaming to complete a typical project? This can really vary depending on what the objective is. If the objective is rather difficult, and if the size of the network is very large, the period of the project could be longer. We've done red teaming operations that have been as short as 2.5 months and as long as 1 year long, where we may conduct even more than one attempt to achieve our goal throughout the period of time. So it really depends on what the organization's objectives are during the red teaming operation, so we can set an appropriate timeline for the project. All right, everyone. Thank you very much for joining today's webinar. There's one more question. A client in general, and I think it's one of our partners playing around. So thank you very much, everyone, for joining today's webinar. And if you have any questions for Pavel and I, you can feel free to email us at our emails that we provided for you here. And our marketing team will send out the PDF copy of the presentation for today. So thank you. Have a good afternoon or morning, wherever you are. Cheers.